Okay, at the time of recording, it's been about a month since my last video, and given how long it normally takes me to edit these, it'll probably be about 2 months by the time this video actually comes out, but I've come with increased production. One advantage of clearing out is I finally have enough room to actually film standing up. So now that I'm freed from my gamer chair with my mic firmly on display, I'm free to flail at my leisure. With my newfound freedom, I thought before we get into the Suicide Squad, which at the point of this video comes out in about 2 days, I thought we'd get into my experiences with Resident Evil. Fair warning, an absolute maniac wrote this script. It's me. I'm the maniac. Resident Evil, ironically, not this one. It's been one of my biggest gateways into the horror genre and is currently squatting in my frontal lobe, avoiding general taxation. This is likely to be the first of several Resident Evil videos that come around before the eventual release of Resident Evil 9, which I predict shall be in 2 to 3 years, but I have no real basis for that, it's just a guess. It's been on my exceptionally long list of games to try for a long time, but all of this really kicked off with the demo for the remake of Resident Evil 3. There's a fixed point within that demo, if you've tried it you'll know, where you exit like the diner build. I think it's a diner. I'm sure I remember it being a diner. You exit a diner and Nemesis spawns. It's a fixed point, he always spawns there. Well, when he spawned there, I completely lost my nerve, I freaked out. I ran back into the diner, back into my false sense of security, thinking I was safe in there, and then he ducked under the doorway. He just ducked in and walked in. So I booked it into the safe room and succinctly uninstalled the demo there and then. That was that. After that, Resident Evil became a sort of a target for me, a target to not only become good enough with horror to be able to cope with this sort of stuff, but to actually enjoy it as well, because it was something I wanted to enjoy. I've taken all the steps along the way, every last one. I've seen the first movie. I actually have all of them, I just haven't gone back around to watching them yet. I've watched the odd 2-3 hour full timeline video thing, and I've seen specifically a walkthrough for the Resident Evil 2 remake. And if we really want to get pedantic about things, my first 50 hours of Resident Evil were actually spent in Dead by Daylight, which I started playing in no small part because of that first Resident Evil chapter. I've spent many a session googling and understanding the madness that goes into these games because they're iconic and because they're the go-to for a genre that I'm becoming increasingly interested in. And it must have been roughly a year and a half ago now when I finally took the plunge. At the time, my curiosity had been already piqued by the existence of Resident Evil Village, and I was currently avoiding all spoilers until I felt like I had the stomach to actually go and play it. And then Capcom went and did the unthinkable. I think we all know how that went. It felt like the right time to finally try and dig my teeth into these games, not even necessarily in order. I knew the bare bones for every mainline entry bar Village, and this wasn't so much about the overall story, this was about experiencing these games for myself and coming to understand the bigger picture as well as the smaller details. So that's what I did. At the time of recording, I finished 4 Resident Evil games to basic completion, and I will be seriously impressed if you actually manage to guess all 4 games, because there's only a teeny tiny modicum of sense in how I've chosen to go about all this. I'm aware I've only scratched the surface, but I've already given myself the goal of completing at least one version of every mainline entry in the series, and with my knowledge of the franchise so far, even the entries that I've played have a really interesting relationship with one another. So I'd like to talk about my experience with the Resident Evil games thus far, and create a sort of baseline for how I will proceed through the franchise going forward, and whether you like it or not, you're coming with me. Now, I don't want to spoil which order I've played the games in, that's half the fun, but for those of you that don't enjoy fun, I will timestamp them below. Let's get this show on the road, shall we? And where better to start than with the one with the biggest reputation for being genuinely terrifying. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Great game, and actually pretty glad it was my first. It's not a bad place to start for a number of reasons, the big one being its generally disconnected nature from the wider franchise. Resident Evil wasn't on the strongest of footings following RE6, so for 7 they went for the soft reboot approach. A back to basics gameplay philosophy with a hard focus on returning to the series' survival horror roots. These were the ingredients to its success and the key to its reputation and anxiety-inducing locations, with the new first-person gameplay really just hammering things home. There was almost no connection to the previous games until right near the end, with one returning character in Chris Redfield and even a new direction for Umbrella. Instead, we got a fresh story with new characters. Ethan Winters, a faceless everyman type, would prove to be a more relatable protagonist than more recent ones, as he attempts to save his wife, who has been missing for 3 years, from a mold-infested family property in Louisiana. Despite the generally grim nature of the Baker home, RE7 is a pretty good baby's first Resident Evil. It tries very hard to be something new while still remaining faithful to the soul of the series. It's got the usual schlockiness and it follows the same tropes and gameplay staples, like insane puzzles and nonsense architecture, and the characters and story are pretty good too. The horror is excellent if you can stomach it. But I'd be lying if I said any of this was how I came to play RE7 first. Again, I cannot stress this enough. There was a quote from the producers around the time that they were developing Resident Evil 8 about RE7 possibly being just too scary. This at a time where I probably couldn't get through Dead Space, never mind Alien Isolation. What that basically means is that one of the biggest barriers to getting into Resident Evil was going to be justifying the cost of a game I wasn't sure if I'd be able to make it to the end of. Lucky for me then, because I got Biohazard through PlayStation Plus. That's it. That's the only actual reason I played Biohazard first. Honestly, I think this worked in my favour. Playing Biohazard is like playing Resident Evil without the burden of history. Narratively, you lose nothing, having never played Resident Evil before. Chris and Umbrella's roles are so minute that they have no real impact on RE7 as an experience, certainly not prior to the DLC. You're completely focused on Ethan's ordeals and trials as he makes his way through the Bakers and tries to understand the secrets of the mold. The game does start to drag a little at the end, but that's fine because they balanced it with a P19 machine gun. And gameplay wise, well, it's Resident Evil. You're given a handful of intricate architectural monstrosities to puzzle solve and key collect your way through that are in some description defended by a boss. Some pretty good ones at that. Jack Baker's a fine boss, absolutely love him, and I have rarely felt hatred like I have for Lucas.
I know. Fucking password, right?
Its first-person presentation may be inspired by stuff like PT, but what you're actually looking at is very Resident Evil. From items dotted around the areas to giant eyes on bosses, or the most bizarre shotgun stand for a puzzle. Like, who built this? Gunplay incorporated the RE4 sway, but the way you find weapons and items is very much classic Resident Evil in its operation. You've got storage boxes and safe rooms and backtracking and gun upgrades. It's all here. It's a great way to get used to all the base systems that have travelled throughout these games without having to worry about how they're attached to each of the individual entries. It introduces some new stuff too, blocking namely, and healing's a bit easier with it being a one button affair as long as there's one in your inventory. However, this does have the added side effect of not wanting to press the button by accident, which I have done on a number of occasions. It's not great. When you're playing a game where you want to keep on top of your resources and you watch your character whip out a health med when you're perfectly fine, your tip-top position, it kind of hurts. It's like stubbing your toe. But while getting used to the gameplay systems of Resident Evil is a very pleasant effect of playing RE7 first, I'd argue it works much more effectively as a horror game. Resident Evil 7 is terrifying. Let's just get out of the way now. It is absolutely terrifying. I'm sure if they had this game at Monsters Incorporated, they would not have had an energy crisis. I'm sure there are people that will disagree, there always are, but it is objectively unsettling, and that is the minimum I will take, at the very least on the first playthrough. Resident Evil and horror games in general are no stranger to disturbing locations. Environmental design is a key factor in many of the biggest horror games, but the Baker family home has something a bit special, a plausibility to it. Outside of the layout and stuff, I'm convinced every building in Resident Evil games were designed by the same person, because how else do you design the door to the yard needing 3 dog head things? Who put that there? Who implemented that? How does it work? Don't get me wrong, they've used relatable locations before, from police stations to hospitals to creepy mansions, which are sort of borderline. But especially in the early stages, this is just an old house in the middle of nowhere. It's been lived in. There are memories here, and as screwed up as they are now, The bakers still live here, but the whole place has been tainted. The buildings are running down, collapsing, everything inside it is rotting, and it's become a monster den as the mold quite literally spreads through the house. It does make for an incredible location though. One of Resident Evil 7's greatest weapons is an intense feeling of claustrophobia. There are relatively few open areas, certainly no large ones, and for the most part you're confined to corridors barely wide enough for two people to pass each other, which is very relevant.
Did you just slip out before dinner was done?
It makes the yard such a breath of fresh air when you finally get out there. Things open up a bit in some areas, but that normally isn't a good thing. It normally means you're about to get clapped. Even in the game's tightest areas like tunnels or like shimmying gaps in walls, it likes to make things even more distressing with every variety of local insect. The atmosphere is the largest offender though, by far. It's always quiet, but you're never too far from a rogue footstep, a creaky board, or a suspiciously loud door. Of course, the atmosphere would have no weight without threat. But there's plenty of threat. Biohazard's general enemy type is the molded. They used to be people, but now they're just sort of... yeah. Aside from being a bit bullet spongy, the molded could be worse. Their spawns are mostly fixed, but they are kind of samey, especially by the ship up until the point of balance with the P19 machine gun. But they do hurt an unreasonable amount. I'll give them that. They really hurt. But what really drives you further into a corner, especially early on, is the fear of a stalker. Stalkers have become almost synonymous with Resident Evil recently. They're pretty large enemies, they follow you around, they do a reasonable amount of damage, and the most you can really do is slow them down. Mr. X, Nemesis, and Lady Dimitrescu are all recent and popular examples, and the Baker family is quite fond of the concept, Jack in particular. Jack Baker is the first area boss and the most recurring antagonist throughout Biohazard, but you may call him Daddy.
Did anyone see you? Did he see you?
Hey, who else is here? What the hell's going on?
Daddy's coming. We need to go.
Daddy?
Jack is a true stalker, appearing throughout your escapades through the main house to add the odd little heart palpitation here and there. He makes the house feel just that little bit smaller, and Jack and the main house are both so effective that by the time I actually got out into the yard, I took a break from the game for 8 months. At least in my experience, the main house is easily the scariest area of the game though. Once you're through there, it's not as bad. The old house is more concerned with being grimy, the testing facility is just messed up beyond belief, and the ship's main threat comes from a sheer number of enemies and a lack of resources up until the point of balance. I don't know if I'd even call the mine an area, it's more just like an extended tunnel. But all the areas carry that claustrophobic vibe in the sense that horror could be around any corner. Despite how insane some things within this little swamp are, it never quite crosses that line to ridiculousness. The point is that the atmosphere and aesthetics and vibes from Resident Evil are immaculate throughout the entire thing. And by pushing my way through to the end and enjoying myself greatly, I not only proved that I could do it, but I also managed to get through one of the creepiest pieces of media I think I've ever come across. Getting myself through Biohazard was the push I needed. It gave me the confidence to take on a lot more horror-oriented games. Not that I'd need that for the next one, because now we're going to jump into
Resident Evil 4.
That's right, next I jumped into the Resident Evil 4 2005. The only game I didn't need to play specifically for this video because I had footage and it was actually usable. I don't know what happened, it was just so dark. I didn't have this problem with Alan Wake, whatever. So I had some time and I'd managed to get RE4 dirt cheap on Steam, as it often is. And the general idea was to play for it now so that I could play the remake on release. I didn't, but that was the original plan. RE4 was really interesting to me because the game's reputation precedes it quite significantly. It's seen as one of the greatest games of all time and not without reason. Not only is it the game that completely broke Resident Evil for better and for worse, but also because of the impact it had on the industry as a whole. It's also the missing link between the classic Resident Evil trilogy and whatever happened in 5 and 6, so it's safe to say I had expectations, but I also didn't know all that much. I keep in touch with gaming pretty heavily now, but go back, say, before 2010 and my knowledge is not nearly as strong. Outside of knowing that Ashley was a general menace to society, I was pretty out of the loop on this one, with my previous experience being more story related. So you can imagine my shock in the first 2 full minutes of gameplay and me reconciling with the existence of tank controls. I'm sorry, I have to talk about this because I'm so torn on whether I love or hate the control scheme for this game. I already knew what tank controls were, I'm no spring chicken, and I'm fully aware of how the classic games played. But what I knew about 4 in this extent was the transition to full over-the-shoulder camera and a more action-oriented gameplay style. So I think I can be forgiven for being a touch taken aback by the continued presence of these systems. You stack that on top of the stop and shoot mechanics, as well as needing to go into your inventory to swap to any weapon or use literally anything, again, leftover mechanics that I figured subconsciously that I thought we would have moved past. And it makes RE4 a very strange experience, especially considering some of the other changes. I'm speaking namely of how much more action oriented the game is. There is still horror left in here, just not much, certainly not when compared to RE7. Both its design and date means that most of the fear, most of the scares come from tight areas, tough enemies, and actually taking up all my healing items. But this is where I come back around to maybe the controls are genius. The light gun style shooting is genuinely engaging, especially when you start to get the hang of it. The ability to shoot projectiles out of the air or shoot like pipe bombs, or I think it's dynamite, isn't it, in the hands, leaves for genuine skill expression and decision making, and with it locking you into place you need to consider timing and positioning as well. Then there's movement. Despite the quick turn, movement is, generally speaking, quite slow, so you have to consider your positioning ahead of time, and if movement isn't a quick escape, then an enemy at close range is a very serious threat. Double that if their head happens to be an arrangement of bladed whips, or they happen to have a chainsaw fetish, for example. RE4 does have quite a lot of semi-open spaces, but you're still very likely to get cornered if you're not considering the most efficient path forward and always staying on the move. So while the controls were a bit whiplashy, shall we say, especially so soon after RE7, they actually do a pretty good job of limiting your options just enough to keep the survival part of survival horror in the game, even if most of it is simply carried over mechanics from the classic trilogy. But I think this was the sort of lens I viewed most of Resident Evil 4 with. It's a game that feels like it's from 2005, which is a period I haven't played a ton from, certainly not recently. It places me in the odd position of having to judge this from a recent Resident Evil experience instead of its revolutionary release 20 years ago. But don't fret. An older game doesn't scare me. There's a lot to love about RE4. We've already touched on the gameplay, but it also has a ton of great enemy design, interesting bosses, revamped systems like the merchant and gun upgrades, that's the word I was looking for. A lot of fun weapons and combat options, like roundhouse kicking people in the face. That never gets old. Location design is fantastic too, which helps to sort of get past the fact that the game is much more linear than previous. And Leon got so strong between games that they had to nerf him as soon as possible by taking that luscious jacket. I'm still mad. There are of course negatives to balance this out, but I feel like a lot of them come down to personal preference. The game is very campy with its characters and the absurdity of the general situation, which is fine. It makes the game very entertaining, a lot of fun, but I do feel like it undermines the weight of the situation sometimes for me.
No thanks, bro.
Then there's that increased linearity. Puzzle solving and just generally exploring the map doesn't feel nearly as satisfying when you realise you've just made a really big circle. Ashley can be a bit of a pain too. She isn't there all that much. She wasn't nearly as bad as I was expecting to be. But there are a few nightmare situations, and to be fair, I'm pretty sure I killed her more than any enemies did. None of these issues stop the game being fun though, by any stretch. It does require a twinge more knowledge of other RE games, but it establishes what happened at Raccoon City at the start of the game, so I don't think anyone would be that lost. It's also a lot closer to the original games in terms of the vibe, the ridiculousness of the situation, in terms of what's going on and what you're interacting with. So it could be considered a vibe check of sorts for the original trilogy, if that's something you might be interested in. But when it comes to RE4, there's a lot to say, and I have more to say still. But we're going to circle back. Because with Resident Evil 7 and RE4 creating a sort of a template, a basis for my experience with Resident Evil, there's only really one place to go next. I was going to start this section with something about Village not being as popular, but it has a higher IGN score, it's got overwhelmingly positive on Steam, and from what I can tell, there isn't a lot in it for people in terms of what they like about 7 and 8. So now I'm wondering if I just made the whole thing up, but I think there is another possibility. Resident Evil is an interesting franchise, especially when you look at how it chooses to balance horror and action. The games kind of fall on a spectrum, with 7 and 4 being very extreme ends of that spectrum for horror and action respectively. Village decided to sit sort of in the middle? Maybe it's more accurate to say it ping-pongs between both extremes. While it is a straight sequel to Biohazard, spiritually it's a lot closer to 4, but it's a mix that's hard to describe if you haven't played the game. The skeleton, I think we'll say, is very Biohazard. Same first-person perspective and gunplay, the act of actually playing the game is more or less the same. Has a similar atmosphere too and a vibe in terms of the way it uses music, lighting, the way it presents events to you.
Let's take a look at him. Well, Ethan Winters.
And there are a good few sections where you can feel that RE7 horror really shining through. Obviously, story-wise, it's a direct continuation with a lot of the same characters, a lot of references to the events of RE7. But the meat on its bones is Resident Evil 4, intensely so, with some elements being downright copied. Most notably the shop and the upgrade system, which is pretty much a one-to-one for RE4. It's even run by a mysterious merchant, though here they have a name, the Duke. It has a more action-packed style of gameplay, upping your options alongside the amount of enemies, and the setting is also very referential. There's even a whole segment based around a giant fish. But I take no issue with these similarities, nothing is original anymore, blah blah blah, and I would argue Village has more than enough to stand on its own. In fact, I think personally, a lot of the things it borrowed from RE4 were done better in Village. I will not elaborate on that. My point is that most RE games seem to lean one way much harder than the other, though both elements are typically present. Village, on the other hand, has a much clearer distinction between the parts of the game that are more survival oriented and the parts of the game that are more action oriented. This seems to have had the bizarre effect of not going far enough in either direction for some people, which I think is where I got my interpretation of Village not being as popular. Fans of RE7 would have preferred more horror and preferred the more survival based gameplay, whereas fans of 4 will find themselves at home in the setting and the action based set pieces. Clearly this was more about fans of specific types of Resident Evil over the opinion of the general fan base, but I find this, generally speaking, quite interesting because it's the mix of both the horror and the action that has made me so enamoured with this game. In fact, I think using the 4 lords and their designated areas as a ways to present different types of gameplay, effectively levels, was a really interesting way to keep things fresh. House Beneviento especially being very horror heavy and being effectively a giant puzzle accompanied with a giant baby. That being sandwiched between the more RPD-esque Castle Dimitrescu and the maze-like area of the Fishman really helps to break the status quo often. I personally enjoyed Village a ton, despite its referential style and its shortcomings that so far it probably is my favourite Resident Evil game. That's including the final game on this list, which we'll get to shortly. It's not hard to poke at Village's flaws, underutilised and underdeveloped villains, especially Mother Miranda, the final boss, and the locations can sometimes feel underused. I think Castle Dimitrescu was a big one of this. A fairly nonsensical plot with insane character decisions and the reliance on RE4 should you consider that a problem. But like, they're very Resident Evil flaws. Honestly, I feel like it borrowed a lot of its flaws with the systems it borrowed from RE4. If you want to talk about an underdeveloped cast, I wouldn't take a critical lens to that particular game. When it comes to having monsters instead of zombies or something more classically biological, I don't even think that's really a criticism, it's just a nitpick. And me personally, I'm more of a monster guy, so if anything, I won that particular battle. To me, Village felt like a greatest hits of all the stuff I was starting to really enjoy about Resident Evil. It's got a fun story that is suitably ridiculous, it looks gorgeous, and the gameplay is fantastic, which is becoming a staple of Resident Evil games thanks to the absolute hunk that is the RE engine. And it even has some absurd revelations toward the end, and I personally love an absurd revelation.
I can't do anything. Anything but this.
You've got some fun bosses, admittedly they are some of the weaker ones so far in the franchise, but they do the job. Hammy dialogue with great delivery, keys, we all love keys, and that one absolutely insane Chris section at the end, I love it, it's great, no complaints. I get why it wouldn't be a lot of people's favourite Resident Evil, but for me personally there are only a handful of things I don't genuinely enjoy about the game. Straight afterwards I went right into Shadows of Rose because I didn't want it to be over yet and I wanted to know what on earth happened there, and I have no doubt I'll be back at some point to try the third person mode to see what kind of a difference that makes. Before we move on, another thing that made Village so interesting to me was my own personal progress. Between my playthroughs of RE4 and RE Village, there was another 8 months. I am not planning this just kind of happens. When it came to playing through Biohazard, the main goal was simply to make it through, which is why it is the only time in my life. Okay, that's not true. It was the first time in my life I've played the game on easy mode. I did the same with RE4, however I kind of wished by the end that I had played it on normal because I didn't realise how much softer the horror was going to be, so yeah, I didn't mind. Village was the first time I'd played a Resident Evil game on normal. In fact, I think it's the first time I played a horror game on normal. I knew what to expect from the franchise, and by this point I was actually starting to look forward to the scarier sections because I was starting to really get into horror with how much more I was starting to enjoy it and how much I'd expose it to myself over the last 8 months. It's about here, maybe a little before I started Village, that you could say I'm in for the long haul. I'm very down with Resident Evil, and they are quickly rising up the ranks as some of my favourite things to play, especially for this video. I've played like 5 of them back to back. Well, 1 of them twice, but 5. I'm coming to grips with the lore, realising how ridiculous the whole thing is, and that's only dragging me deeper. So here we are. I've played the reboot that served as a return to form, and I've played one of the best games of all time, which managed to burn its franchise to the ground. I'm officially a lost cause, and I hope that I can play most, if not all, of Resident Evil before 9 comes out. At a respectable pace, of course. A respectable pace that can wait, because I waited all of 5 minutes before I started the final game. Here we are at the final game, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and I may have missed the release by several months, but we got there in the end and that's what matters. RE4 Remake has been quite the experience, especially because I don't think I have seen a single negative comment toward this game. There is no one that's played it that's arguing it's not a fantastic piece, and obviously it was a big contender when it came to awards season. It seems to be falling into the same sphere of quality that the original did, the original being known as one of the best games of all time, and this being seen as the same in the remake category. It helps that its only real competition seems to be the RE2 remake. But as with the original game, it's very easy to understand why. Gameplay is stellar, effectively acting as a smoother rendition of the original. All the weapons feel great, and I love the way the enemies interact with them. I will say, I found it harder to trip people up this time around, which I find a huge loss for comedic value alone. There have been some great additions too, with the biggest being the bolt thrower, which is a cross between a crossbow and the mine launcher from the original, as well as the new knife. Stabby McStab was in the original game, but he certainly didn't have this level of functionality. You can still whip it out to shank things, which isn't nearly as necessary now that there's actually an interact button to destroy boxes, but it does still help when enemies are on the ground and you don't need to, shoot them, which is very similar to how it was in the original. Easily the biggest improvement though, and arguably one of the most defining factors of this remake, is the new parry system. It allows you to parry most attacks, not all, but most, at the cost of some durability to your knife. The main knife can be repaired at the merchant, which is just expensive enough to hurt. You can also find mini knives around the place, which you can use for certain crafting options, or just use them as a replacement for your main knife until you find the next merchant, though they do have a lot less power and durability. Parrying is very intrinsically satisfying. What also makes it great is if you get the timing right, you can do the melee attack, which, roundhouse kicks someone in the face. Again, never gets old. To me, the parry system felt borderline necessary for the remake. Obviously, it brings back RE4's considerably advanced number of enemies, including reintroducing miscellaneous flying axes. This is important because while you can now move and shoot, Leon is one hefty bitch. You feel every step he takes, and that's not a bad thing. It's very immersive. You can literally feel it. The camera shakes with each step he takes. There's an audible gap between There's a feelable gap between each step. It's actually quite reminiscent of the original game, which I really like about it. But it does mean maneuvering around enemies, especially bigger groups in tighter spaces, can be quite difficult, and it most certainly isn't impossible to get stun locked. The parry is what alleviates this pressure and gives you an option where you feel like you might not have had one before, certainly not one so easily readable. It really keeps up the pace of the action, and it wasn't a faultless mechanic by any stretch of the imagination. They get a lot of mileage out of the new knife and the new parry system, specifically in regards to the new Krauser fight. The knife and the parry are how Capcom brought Resident Evil 4's gameplay philosophies into the modern age without destroying the patience of anyone that hasn't played a game prior to the 360 era. And most areas of the remake see this modernization applied to the original. A lot of the puzzles are adapted from the original, but very few are actually one-to-one. Most have been modernized and smoothed out in an attempt to make them more interactive. The map has been made less blatantly linear and much less completely insane, and designs and characterizations have also been brought up to modern times in a way that keeps their essence but also makes them feel more complete. However, and that's a big however, puzzle-wise it was sort of like they couldn't decide what to leave and what to keep. For example, the church light puzzle is still there exactly how it was in the original, but the dial puzzle that was behind the church has been modified and has become a recurring locked gate puzzle where you have to search for nearby symbols. Nothing's been put behind the church, nothing has replaced it, it's just been changed and moved around. And that's only one example. This isn't necessarily a problem. It's just something that feels like there's no particularly cohesive vision behind it, because why is the church light puzzle still there? It's a similar situation with the map. There are a lot of changes to the map, though I would argue with the map, there's a much clearer idea behind it. It seems to be about moving a lot of the larger circular paths, the ones that you go down purely to go back through. Those ones seem to be mostly removed. So stuff like the cable cars that lead you to the Mendez fight, or the frankly ridiculous path you have to take after you first meet Salazar. But again, it feels a bit pick and choose in terms of what was too ridiculous to keep. I'm not saying I miss when Ashley ran down a dead-end corridor which just so happened to be a conniving trap, but at the same time, courtyard maze, you feel me? Again, it's not the end of the world, it's not by any stretch of the imagination something that really detracts from this game. It just really threw me for like a grand total of 2 hours when there was a door under Salazar when you first meet him. For the most part though, it is a lot more consistent in terms of the most outlandish parts of the map being removed, like the lava room and stuff like that. Characters and story are definitely where you feel the biggest impact in terms of this rework, and I would say it's mostly in a good way. Mostly. Just about all the main cast benefits from a little rework. Leon, Ada, Ashley, Louise, they all feel a lot more complex, complete, and they fit much more snug within the narrative itself. Louise is the big standout for me. It felt a lot less like he was improved and more like he was just written correctly. You can argue the villains falter a bit, except for Krauser. Krauser gets a big boost from the remake, but Sadler and Salazar lose a bit of their spunk. Honourable mention to Mendez, who is now slightly more than a big man with a glass eye. Only a little more, but it is a step forward. And narratively, the whole thing feels a bit less like an action movie. It is an action movie, but it feels like it's taking itself much more seriously this time around, and I feel like that was probably necessary for the heavier atmosphere to land. But I do find this to be a bit of a monkey paw situation. You know, you gain something but you lose something else. See, the original game is real fucking stupid. I don't mean that in a bad way by any stretch. I'm just think about it. Really think about it. After being chased by a bunch of ravenous, mind-controlled civilian people with pitchforks and stuff, you take a massive detour to find this one guy's glass eye because that's the one specific object you need to open the castle gates. Why? Who can say? You then proceed to take the second fattest detour known to man to find some missing pieces from a mural which just rose from the ground? Does it rise or does it fall? Rose from the ground? Like, have you seen the map for this section? It's insane. Salazar has a listening tube down his spike hole. The statue of Doom, Louise appearing for like 30 seconds, being like, damn, I must have dropped it back there. I'll meet you guys ahead, and then he just disappears again. Hell, how could I forget? Laser corridor. I'm actually pretty glad that showed up in separate ways, though. That was fun. I like that. The whole thing is ridiculous, but the game has so much charm and is so fun to play that we don't care. Fun and charm that are ever so slightly held back when you try and take the game more seriously. Not that the remake is trying to be like a piece of art or anything, it's still a Resident Evil game, but it does take the events much more seriously than the original counterpart did, and it tries to push the horror back into the game a lot more. This means that despite all the improvements the remake has made, it actually becomes a lot easier to see the cracks and the flaws in the characters and story. In grounding the tone and events of the game, I think they unintentionally removed a lot of the charm from Resident Evil 4, charm that led most people to love the game in the first place. So that's why I think that not only is the original still worth playing now, but there's more than enough differences. I think it might actually be the one with more worth to go back to, which is not how I thought I would feel coming out of this whole situation. It probably all depends on what you're looking for. The remake is gorgeous, has much smoother gameplay and a great set of performances, but the original has so much more charm to it, even with its insane control scheme, and there are a few experiences like that original game. But that's one thing that's so great about Resident Evil, isn't it? The variety. These games follow a certain blueprint. There are certain things you come to expect from all of these games, from puzzles and locked doors to the Magnum and a rocket launcher to finish the final boss. Admittedly, the last two haven't done that, but still. They share a lot, but they all arrive in a different package. Even in my own limited experience of Resident Evil, it's taken me through extravagant castles, mysterious villages, wrecked ships, and scariest of all, Louisiana. I've hunted for items with varying levels of desperation, ran from larger-than-life creatures, and beat the odds time and time again. They're scary, action-packed, cheesy, and fun. I've spent numerous hours with super spy Leon S. Kennedy and Ethan Winters, the persevering father and husband, and despite the differences in their characters and adventures, I can't say either one doesn't belong in this absolute roller coaster of a franchise. I'm fully aware how messed up it is that I've played 7, 4, 8 and 4.2. But I maintain that this isn't as monstrous as it sounds, and the proximity of these games in terms of release, story, gameplay, stuff like that has fostered really interesting relationships. And at the end of the day, what this really comes down to, what the point of all of this was that I'm super excited to play literally every Resident Evil game under the sun, because I get to experience more of all of this. So those are the 4 Resident Evil games I've played so far. Apologies for this game being a bit insane as a whole 4-in-1 situation, but I've been wanting to make a Resident Evil video for a fair while now, and the connections between these games, it was really interesting rather than try and make an individual video on each one. I know there's probably a lot I didn't cover or a lot I didn't best explain, but I'm trying to the best of my ability to be brief. I've been recording for roughly an hour and a half because I can't remember my own lines, and I can only imagine how long this video is going to actually end up being. But I hope the main point of this video actually came across, just that I'm completely falling in love with Resident Evil for all its quirks and connections and the stuff that makes it weird. I absolutely love it. I understand why it's one of the biggest franchises ever, and also why it's at probably one of the peaks of its popularity. I would expect this to be a recurring thing until at least Resident Evil 9. From there, we'll see. Right, but going forward, I'll probably make a video on every Resident Evil game I play in some capacity. It shouldn't be any more than 2 per video, I wouldn't think. I can only think of one circumstance where I'd do 3-in-1. That would be the original trilogy, but other than that, this won't be happening again, which is for the best for all of us, I think. I've actually got some pretty interesting directions I can go from here. I can play 5 and 6 to cover the gap from 4 to 7, which is very tempting because I have a friend lined up to play 5 co-op with, so that's something. Or I go back, I play the original, I play the remakes for 2 and 3, and I look to play the original 2 and 3. I'm not too fussed about playing the original 2, I'll do it eventually, I'm just not too fussed about doing it before Resident Evil 9. 3 I do want to play because I know how different the remake is. I've also got Revelations in there and 0, and I should probably go back and play Code Veronica at some point. So if you've got recommendations about how to sliver my way through this, let me know. Just as a side note, I finally watched a video on Code Veronica, and now I get it. Why was it not remade when it's so integral to the whole Wesker story? I don't know, I'm just saying, assuming we get a remake for 5 next, which you would imagine is the next remake. I don't know. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, if you actually got this far. Leave a like, comment, subscribe if you want to see me get through the rest of Resident Evil, and thank you if you supported the Alan Wake video. That far outdid my expectations, and I'm still kind of confused by it, if I'm honest. Let me know how you feel about this whole new setup as well. This is really awkward because my green screen's really short. It stops there, so I can't actually film enough of myself and have my camera see the whole green screen. So yeah. Next video should be Suicide Squad because I'm morbidly curious, but I'm going to wait until the Season 1 comes out because I feel like if I'm going to talk about the Suicide Squad, I need to talk about the live service elements, and yeah, that starts in March. So I'm going to wait for that. There might be a smaller video in the middle. The new Silent Hill thing came out last night. I might try and make a video on that, we'll see. But if I don't see you before then, I'll see you for the Suicide Squad, probably in April, given how long it takes me to make these videos.